Welcome to Redacted Conversations. Someday some brave soul will actually do a media content analysis on the doctors who were censored on the airwaves during the COVID-19 pandemic, doctors who were in the trenches doing actual research, who were just citing the data, who were witnessing amazing results with natural medicines. Someday we'll see how many voices were silenced by big media. But I'm willing to bet Dr. Peter McCullough will be at the top of that list for most censored voices during the pandemic. Dr. Peter McCullough is an internist, a cardiologist who had the temerity to show the world that certain 50-year-old medicines were effective in stopping COVID. He even testified before Congress, those congressional hearings, and many of them were deleted from the internet. Imagine that. Congressional testimony deleted because we're not allowed to see that. I guess some higher powers didn't like what he was saying about vaccines, COVID-19, and the federal government's response to the pandemic. Well, Dr. McCullough just co-authored a new book along with historian John Leake. The book is called The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. Both Dr. McCullough and John Leake join me now to talk about the book and so much more. I think we're going to talk monkeypox. We'll talk WHO. Gentlemen, thank you guys for joining us here on Redacted.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Guys, I have to admit, as I was doing research and reading the book and looking at, I had to laugh out loud a little bit because your book is number one in a number of categories right now on Amazon, but it's number one in the organized crime category and true crime. And I thought, how fitting is that a book about COVID-19 and the biopharmaceutical response and the government is number one in the organized crime section? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, I believe that it is a story about organized crime. I mean, that's my thesis. I came at this as a true crime author. I've written a couple of true crime books before this one, and my gut instinct told me from the outset of this that we were looking at organized criminal activity. I needed an authoritative, talented, energetic doctor to help me interpret the data, the information, so to speak. But I approached this with the strong suspicion that we were looking at an organized criminal conduct wedded with propaganda. You have this conjoining of very powerful interest with mass media to perpetrate an organized crime.
Right, and at the heart of all of it is lives lost, businesses crushed, families ripped apart. And it's so big. And I guess eventually we'll get an honest assessment here of how this all unfolded. Dr. McCullough, I want to start there, though, on how and why, you were censored or intimidated. You were asked at a congressional hearing by Senator Ron Johnson about that. To start off that congressional hearing, how many of you in this room were censored, intimidated, had professional reprisal thrown at your feet, and your hand went up? Can you talk about the first time you realized like something was afoot here, that they weren't just going to look at the data, look at the medicine, that something bigger was at play?
You were recalling the January 24th U.S. Senate special panel called COVID-19, A Second Opinion. And I co-moderated it with Senator Ron Johnson, about a dozen practicing doctors who had learned how to treat the illness, vaccine consultants and developers, patients, nurses, attorneys. It really was the session of all sessions on COVID-19. We've invited all the relevant heads of the Senate committees, the public health agency officials. None of them showed up. But it was 5 hours of continuous testimony. There's a great 38-minute highlight reel still up on YouTube, amazingly. But I asked the question, how many in the room had actually suffered censorship or professional reprisal for their efforts to help patients in COVID-19? And about 80% of people raised their hands.
Wow.
They were just trying to help people, just trying to, in a sense, fulfill a duty to treat or help in some way. And this could actually be nurses just trying to help patients. They felt professional reprisal for their efforts. It was absolutely a stunning day. And it's going to go down in history. People are going to look back on this and say, what was behind those who were trying to block and stop and extinguish any help to patients with COVID-19?
I have so many notes from the book. I want to encourage our audience to go and read this amazing book. I just kept taking note after note after note on my Kindle. So I have like page after page of notes here. And I just got to say, as you start to unfold the story, John and Dr. McCullough, about hydroxychloroquine, I think most Americans, they were just fed this garbage line about this medicine. And it started almost immediately. And you even point out in the book, okay, President Trump might not have been the best spokesperson for the effectiveness of hydrochloroquine. However, what he said was factually correct at the podium, and yet the Western media literally just jumped down his throat and shut it down.
Yeah, there's a kind of a paradox and an irony in the fact that President Trump becomes the spokesman for an old, safe, and repurposed drug. I mean, to me, this moment in the story goes to the heart of this profoundly neurotic. It's almost a form of just mass insanity. In this moment where Trump becomes the messenger who announces what should have been regarded as a cause for jubilation and hope. There's an old drug. Its ancestors go all the way back to quinine, to the cinchona bark. We've known about this for centuries, and it seems to have anti-inflammatory and antiviral potency against this SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, Trump was sort of awkward in his presentation, but it's a fascinating moment. I think it'll go down as a moment in history of shame, where you realize, as one cognitive psychiatrist who's studied this calls it, it was a moment of unwishful thinking. I mean, normally in the midst of a crisis in which you have a novel infectious disease that's upon mankind, you would expect a sort of embrace of signals of benefit and hope that we have something that could fight this off. But instead, it's this immediate naysaying, shut it down. No, we don't want to hear about an old repurposed drug, even though it's long been understood amongst infectious disease people that Didier Raoult in Marseille, France, being one of the most distinguished microbiologists in history, I mean, certainly the most cited in Europe, he spent his life studying repurposed medications. He's had immense success with molecules that are repurposed to treat different kinds of illnesses. I mean, and this is something that we go into in the book. This whole fascinating arena of repurposed drugs is quite a story unto itself. But I think where the dividing line falls is a lot of them are off patent. They're very, very inexpensive. There's no real profit margin in them. So there's a lack of interest in them amongst commercial interests. And just to add to that one thing, I studied military history, and it's really interesting. I think a point of comparison, an analog, what we call the military-industrial complex, to compare that to what Dr. McCullough and I call the Bio-Pharmaceutical complex. There's strong analogs there that are worthy of exploration.
No, I love that in the book. And if anyone watches my show for any length of time, I always speak out very, very loudly against the military-industrial complex. I think we do a segment on every show about the military-industrial complex. So in the book, you paint the picture, Dr. McCullough, right, that it's $6 to get a hydrochloroquine treatment. And there, and because a lot of it's natural, the patenting process there, it's just not going to make anybody any money. So is it as simple really as following the money, like Occam's razor? Let's just follow the money. These guys were trying to keep this quiet in order to make enormous profits off the backs of this pandemic.
I think so. The trail of information was stunning. Hydroxychloroquine was over the counter in France. It was made prescription. Hydroxychloroquine, freely available and generic in the United States, it had an emergency use authorization put on it that effectively restricted it to the hospital. And then later on, the FDA, a few months later, said, don't use it altogether. Peter Navarro had reached out to me from the White House, seeing if I could help him either balance out this EUA or release it. So I started working with the White House within a few months of my protocol development. I told Tucker Carlson, I said, in Queensland, Australia, very early in April, they put on the books a new law that said a doctor would face imprisonment if the doctor attempted to use hydroxychloroquine to help a COVID-19 patient. And what Tucker asked is, well, how did they know? How did they know that early? And what was behind that? But it was in the minds of people very early on to deny all forms of treatment in order to promote, in my view, fear, suffering, hospitalization, and death in order to drive an agenda.
Well, one of the things you point out, Doctor, and you say, and you just brought it up, was the emergency use authorization kept it from being in hospitals, or only in hospitals. That meant that was a huge problem. Why was that a huge problem, that they could only use it when a patient arrived at the hospital? Can you explain to our audience why that was, in many ways, medical fraud, medical malpractice?
Two things happened, I think, originally out of fear. One was a stockpile of hydroxychloroquine. And the second one was, well, we were going to get a deluge of patients restricted to the hospital setting. Now, Henry Ford had done a huge study, thousands of patients, and when used early, prospective comparative study, consented, really high quality, early hydroxychloroquine in the hospital showed benefit. Later on, there were 5 small clinical trials of people far late in the hospitalization on the ventilator, and those trials were neutral, never showed any harm. Now, Surgeon General of Florida, Joe Ladapo, and myself published a meta-analysis of all the hydroxychloroquine studies early as outpatients, and there was a signal of benefit, about a 25% benefit. So to this day, now with over 300 supportive studies, hydroxychloroquine is one of the most widely used drugs for COVID-19, but there's greater effectiveness with ivermectin and now the new entry Paxlovid. But hydroxychloroquine, I think, played an important historic role. It helped many people. It could have helped more if it wasn't blocked.
Yeah, and it seems like a concerted effort to get this blocked. You paint the story in the book about Dr. Bright saying, no, this has to be only in hospitals. And then you had Governor Cuomo also jumping in on this, issuing an executive order following up on that. And Governor Cuomo at the time, I didn't even know this, got an Emmy Award for his performances behind the podium during those press briefings. I didn't even know that piece of the storytelling. But John, talk about the Cuomo-Dr. Bright connection here in trying to keep hydroxychloroquine out of people's hands.
Well, I think it starts with Dr. Bright, and this is well documented. Dr. Bright himself frankly spoke about it in a documentary film that was released in October of 2020 called Totally Under Control, in which he says when President Trump announced that we have this old malaria drug that seemed to offer some benefit, he Bright himself states, I called my team at BARDA, which is it's a division of Health and Human Services, and they said, well, there's no scientific basis for claiming any efficacy on this. And so follow this bizarre logic. First of all, this wasn't true. There were studies coming out of China, South Korea, and Marseille, France, that were finding signals of benefit. So that was a lie. And then he says, because there was no scientific grounds for believing it could help, I concluded it was unsafe for the American public. So there's this massive sort of leap, from A to Z without any analysis in between, without any deductive reasoning in between. So I felt that I had to restrict this. So I called my contacts at the FDA. We know now it was Janet Woodcock. We crafted an emergency authorization use, but we restricted it to the hospital setting only. So it's this palace intrigue that is being perpetrated against the President of the United States, and they're plainly confessing it. Now they're doing it with a sort of patting on the back, self-congratulatory thing. We protected the American people. But there is absolutely no data to indicate that it was dangerous to the American people. Janet Woodcock had rheumatology training. Hydroxychloroquine has been used for 60 years against rheumatoid arthritis. Its anti-inflammatory properties are very well understood for these autoimmune conditions. This is just a patent fraud.
And Dr. McCullough, you talked about like by the time they got to the hospital and then they were on ventilators, that's too late.
Well, it's true. And not only that, but the hospital offered an opportunity for other things to happen. So, for instance, we published from our center a paper in the American Journal of Cardiology where we describe a woman who's got COVID and she's in the hospital. She's on the mechanical ventilator and she develops an arrhythmia called torsade de pointe. And it's an arrhythmia related to a prolonged QT on the EKG. And people had been pointing to that arrhythmia being caused by hydroxychloroquine. So we give this entire case description, but the key point is she never received a milligram of hydroxychloroquine. The point is people were developing arrhythmias in the hospital due to being sick in the ICU. And in fact, a cytokine that's produced in response to COVID called interleukin-6, that's what was driving the arrhythmias, not hydroxychloroquine. So there was an entire false story that emerged in medicine that hydroxychloroquine was causing arrhythmias and causing problems. This fed into the narrative that hydroxychloroquine should not be used. And, I can tell you this was a travesty. I pointed it out in the U.S. Senate. I called it out as academic fraud. I actually had one of the papers produced from the Mayo Clinic, which went so far to say hydroxychloroquine was causing scars in the heart. I had to force the editor to publish a correction on that. There basically had been academic fraud, and the academic community was complicit in this. There was a completely fraudulent paper published in Lancet, held up on the website for 2 weeks before it was taken down, a similar one in New England Journal of Medicine regarding hydroxychloroquine. It became clear from Queensland, Australia, to the U.S. FDA, the Rick Bright in the White House, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, that hydroxychloroquine had to be squashed in order for this agenda to be carried out.
Go ahead, John. I wanted to follow up on that, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I suspect, and I think there's the totality of circumstances supports my perception that it was suppressed precisely out of the fear within the biopharmaceutical complex that it works. Mm-hmm. If administered early, it could defang this thing. It could help people just enough to prevent this progression, leading into a proper emergency. So I know that sounds really perfidious, sort of, Dr. Evil sort of stuff, but as strange as it is, I mean, if you've studied this for 2 years, as I have, I think the totality of circumstance, shows it was a deliberate suppression of something precisely because the perception was it could help to defang this crisis.
Well, and following the money trail, you lay out very clearly in the book the relationship with a lot of these people making these decisions, right? That were making money off of this. I mean, Gilead and others, and Dr. Fauci and others. I'm curious, Doc, when you talk about the relationship that you had, like Peter Navarro calling you and trying to get this, emergency use authorization through hydroxychloroquine, and you're literally up against their own FDA. What was the relationship between that White House and this White House? Did they ever call you? Has the Biden administration spoken to you, or was it complete silence after that new administration came in?
Peter Navarro, I think, really had great intentions. His frustration was enormous. He knew something was going on. He knew Rick Bright was working very hard to block treatment to America. Rick Bright subsequently joined, by the way, the Rockefeller Foundation, which is a strong supporter of vaccine research. Stephen Hahn, the acting director of the FDA, joins the venture capital firm for Moderna. And his predecessor, Scott Gottlieb, is on the board of Pfizer, advising America on vaccines. So the conflicts of interest were wide open. Navarro was very frustrated. We did the best we could. I did get a letter into the FDA, which was ignored. We had inquisitions that came in from Navarro, from Senator Ron Johnson. We couldn't make any progress there. The story on hydroxychloroquine becomes even more nefarious. The second largest manufacturing plant for hydroxychloroquine outside Taipei, Taiwan, mysteriously burns down. And then we move into the second phase of the pandemic, and there the article of interest now becomes ivermectin, which is even more effective than hydroxychloroquine. But I can tell you, the first White House was mixed. The second White House, absolutely no light for early treatment. They've never reached out to me. I've testified now twice in the U.S. Senate, multiple state senates. I've published the leading papers on treating COVID-19, the home treatment guide, have an entire sets of physician organizations behind this, a blind eye to treatment. In fact, the current White House has brought in their White House COVID coordinator, was the minority witness in our first set of U.S. Senate testimony. This is a person who claims that his idol is Dr. Fauci, and he is someone under sworn testimony who admits he's never seen a COVID patient, he's never examined or treated a COVID patient. That person is the doctor leading the current White House COVID response.
Yeah, and multiple lies before in front of congressional hearings. How this person still has a job, I just do not know. I think I want to talk about that sort of hidden hand a little bit more as we look at the World Health Organization, because you kind of start out really in the book laying out how a lot of these decisions were made, and how Bill Gates, the Bill and Gates, Melinda Gates Foundation, laying out these plans. Well, hey, Bill Gates is out with a new book already, and just in time for the World Health Organization right now, which is meeting as we actually record this interview in Switzerland to lay out their pandemic treaty. I'm just going to give you both the floor, because we've had so many viewers who have said to us, stop the treaty. We don't want to cede our control to some unelected body of globalists. What is your assessment of the World Health Organization and of this new pandemic treaty?
My assessment of the World Health Organization is that it's a front organization for this biopharmaceutical complex that we have examined and written about in our book. You have to think of any human society as a hierarchy, and it's just the nature of our who we are. The human nature is to organize into societies, into social units. And there's a hierarchy, and at the top of it, if all of history, if you look closely, you see it's usually a relatively small number of guys that are calling the shots. And around the year 2000, Bill Gates, who is the wealthiest man in the world, he'd just come off of a scrape with the Department of Justice over purportedly violating the Sherman Antitrust Acts. He was widely perceived as the worst monopolist since John D. Rockefeller. So he said, well, Rockefeller kind of cleaned up his image by starting a foundation strongly developed to public health. If I'm the new Rockefeller, I guess I'll do the same. I mean, that's the other funny thing about this story. It's just out in the open. So he kind of cleans up his act by getting in the public health business. Just as he was sort of obsessed with making Windows the operating system for every man, woman, and child on Earth, he becomes obsessed with vaccine technology. Now, Dr. McCullough and I have spoken at length. Going back to Louis Pasteur and Edward Jenner, vaccines have played a very important role in public health, but it's not the only role. In fact, your viewers may be surprised to hear that the greatest advances in public health have just been clean water and sanitation. I mean, by far, clean water and sanitation, eradicating of the Anopheles mosquito in certain places. I mean, just big sanitation projects. But it's this relentless focus since Bill Gates got in the act on vaccine technology is the only response to public health crisis. There is no other. We don't even need to talk about it. I mean, maybe mosquito nets in Africa. But this is what we culminate with in the year 2020 is this immense biopharmaceutical complex that is solely devoted to rapid deployment and mass deployment of new novel vaccine technology becomes the response. And this is a huge problem. It's a complex problem. This monolithic response is not appropriate, especially when it doesn't work, which is a whole nother subject.
Yeah, and I want to get the doctor's take on the vaccines and efficacy and the deaths and the adverse effects here in a second on vaccines. So we'll get there in a second. Doc, I'll give you the floor now on the World Health Organization meeting right now on this pandemic treaty. Where do you come down on that?
You know, all healthcare is very personal between a doctor and the nurses and the patient, and it's always administered locally. So, you know, one could view this that there's no world authority that would really have any role in the operational delivery of healthcare. It just doesn't work that way. Not only that, it's so different from Central Africa to Manhattan to Hong Kong. Healthcare is vastly different across the world. The World Health Organization, I think over time has been helpful in terms of, a data analytic organization. It's created certain definitions we rely on, like the definition of anemia, etc. But this now power grab for the WHO to actually have binding authority and have legally binding flows of money to it from member countries. And it could decide pandemic status for the world. It could decide lockdown status, start to actually administer policy that would affect every participating country is, I think, the recipe for a global disaster. Certain countries, Brazil is not in. They're a huge country. They're not in. They say, forget it.
Right.
And I can tell you, I hope more countries wake up to this because it just doesn't offer us anything. Certainly the United States offers us nothing of value.
Yeah, and they get to pawn off these decisions to these globalists to say, well, the World Health Organization told us this, so we're going into lockdown again. And we've seen the disastrous effects of that in the book. Certainly, you lay that out very well, what these lockdowns did, certainly to children, to young people who didn't need that at all. And then, of course, throwing together people in 75 years of age and older into lockdown, in the nursing homes and et cetera. Just can you give me an assessment of where you come down on lockdowns, doctor? As we're talking about this now with monkeypox, now we're seeing this in Belgium and so forth. Where do you come down on the idea of isolating individuals?
It was about a month after my 2020 publication in the American Journal of Medicine, the first paper that taught doctors how to treat COVID. About a month or two later, the Great Barrington Declaration was published and presented by Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Sunitra Gupta from Oxford. And the Great Barrington Declaration had it right that we should apply risk stratification and only protect and have special measures for our seniors. Everyone else should have just been, back to work, back to school as normal, and we could have managed the cases as they arise, the high-risk patients, and treated them. They had it right. Lockdowns did great harm. There's analysis from Johns Hopkins showing they had absolutely negligible effect because of this basic principle. If you lock down millions of people who don't have the virus, it can't do anything. I mean, only symptomatic people are the ones who transmit the illness, not everybody who's well. And so it was one of these common sense things that we only need to isolate those acutely sick and for a relatively short time while we treat them. By the way, early treatment at home markedly reduces the infectivity period from about 14 days to about 3 days with SARS-CoV-2. Now enter monkeypox. Monkeypox, I think, deserves a great degree of skepticism. NTI, an organization, held a biosecurity conference in Munich in March of 2021, and they announced a monkeypox outbreak is coming. They said the release date was going to be May 15th, just a week before the WHO meeting. And then like clockwork, we started hearing stories about monkeypox cases. What we know about monkeypox, it's been around for decades. A review on monkeypox by Simpson and colleagues. There was a monkeypox meeting in London in 2019, summarized 40 years of data. And what we know there is that it's very manageable. It's sporadic. It's a orthopox virus, large pustular lesions. It's spread by breaking the pustules and touching them or through saliva. The only fatal cases have happened in severe concurrent HIV disease. And we treat it with the drug, an FDA-approved drug called tecovirimat or TPOXX, orally. And now the FDA just, 5 days ago approved it IV. It's almost as if all this was planning. And then, the CDC releases to us in April 22nd a report from Dallas. Right here in Dallas, there was a case of monkeypox. So a man that comes from Africa, he goes to Atlanta, then Dallas, he comes in contact with tons of people, develops monkeypox. He's hospitalized largely just to isolate him. And he's given the TPOXX drug, does fine, perfectly fine. But the interesting thing about that article is it has dozens of authors, and they're called the Monkeypox Response Team. So there was some type of monkeypox response team assembled by the CDC, and they characterize all these contacts that he had, dozens and dozens of contacts. Not a single person got the illness. Not a single person got the illness. Now, this morning on CNBC, we have Scott Gottlieb on the board of Pfizer, vaccine enthusiast, former FDA director, talking about ring vaccination, actually vaccinating a ring of people around these monkeypox cases. And we heard that the U.S. had pre-purchased 13 million doses of the Syneos live attenuated monkeypox vaccine. And in the regulatory documents, we are stunned to learn 18% of people who get this vaccine get heart damage. So it couldn't be a worse story for vaccines.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's not unbelievable. If anyone's been following this story for any length of time, to hear that they make this announcement in Munich, and then to the day almost, we get the exact outbreak of monkeypox. It's all over the mainstream media. It's all over. It's an absolute it's like what you see in war. It's like what we see right now unfolding in Europe and Ukraine. It's amazing how all of the mainstream media falls lockstep with these stories almost immediately. I want to talk about the vaccine effectiveness here. And a lot of I asked my audience specifically, and they really wanted to hear your thoughts on vaccine deaths and where you are on that number breakdown. 46,000 adverse reactions out of all people who took the shot in the country in the first 90 days. Where do we see the data right now pointing to vaccine deaths, people who took the vaccine and then developed severe adverse reactions or died? Where does that data point us today?
We have several sources of information. The most direct source is the Pfizer documents themselves. Pfizer, the lead manufacturer, under lawsuit for release of information. Remember, the lawyer for the FDA did not want to release these documents to Americans for 55 years. For the FDA, right. The FDA did not want to release the information. And here's the reason why. The documents came out, and Pfizer knew about 1,223 deaths worldwide within 90 days of release of their product. That's just the first 90 days. People were dying quickly. Pfizer had hired 600 employees just to man the phone lines as people were dying, and they were receiving the reports. No wonder Pfizer wanted to cover this up, and the FDA was basically in collusion with Pfizer to cover this up. 1,291 new separate diseases caused by this genetic vaccine. And now, as we look forward across all the vaccine products in the United States, our CDC is verifying over 12,000 Americans have died within a few days of taking the vaccine. The typical standard is 50 deaths. We pull the product off the market. It's not considered safe. To run it up to 12,000 deaths, in our U.S. VAERS system outside, including Germany and Japan, we have well over 30,000 deaths now. And so, there's mass protests. You'll see film reels of parents having, mass simulated funerals for all the children who have died. I mean, it's really it's grotesque what's going on in terms of death after vaccination. People have asked, how big can this be? Pantazatos and Saligman from Colombia have published, using U.S. Census data and administration data from the vaccines, the number through December could be as high as 178,000 Americans may have died after the vaccine. And you know where that's showing up? It's showing up in the life insurance claims of young employed people across the country.
Wow. And of course, we won't learn about this, right? Because we'll be censored by even reporting this story. I mean, when we went through Pfizer's own documents on our show on YouTube, they took us down and banned us for a week. And even though we were reading verbatim from Pfizer's own documents, we were banned, and they labeled it medical misinformation, even though these were Pfizer's own documents. So it's very difficult to get this information out to people.
Yes, this is obvious tyranny, censorship, fraud. I mean, I think we need to recognize that what we're up against now is a fraudulent and tyrannical regime. One of the things that we talk about in our book is this mass psychology, and there's a particular component of mass psychology which is very difficult to come to terms with. We characterize it in a chapter in which I refer to a play that was published and produced in Switzerland in the year 1953 by a guy named Max Frisch, called Biedermann and the Arsonists. And just real quickly, the play recounts these two arsonists are afoot in this town and they're burning down buildings. The protagonist of the play is reading the paper. He can't believe, who on earth would run around our beautiful old city burning down houses? And he reads that their modus operandi is to introduce themselves as traveling salesmen in need of lodging for the night. They then talk their way into the homes of people, are put up in the attic or in an upstairs apartment in the house, and then they burn the place down. The protagonist thinks, well, I would never fall for such, who would be so gullible? An hour later, the doorbell rings, and it's these two traveling salesmen, and they seem so normal. They're sort of charming and funny and nice looking boys. And they say, yeah, we're traveling salesmen and, we're in need of lodging for the night. And the theme of the play is that within a human society, really evil stuff can spread out in the open. And we don't see it. It's we probably have to bring a cognitive psychologist onto the show. We don't see it because it's hiding in plain sight. We make the assumption that these kinds of perfidious schemes would be clandestine. There would be people, planning and plotting behind closed blinds, when in fact it's just right in front of us. The document, it's just right there.
It's just like with the military-industrial complex, right? In the 70s, they used to plant people from the military and CIA in newsrooms clandestinely. Now they're just on the payroll. I mean, look at, you got like a guy like Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who literally is on CNBC every day, and he's on the board of Pfizer. You have generals who literally are on the board of these weapons contractor companies, and they're on television telling you about how we need more war. So it's right in front of us. You're right. They're not even trying to hide it anymore.
I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned the military stuff, because it's just such a clear parallel here. I remember a few years ago reading a Washington Post op-ed saying that there needs to be all of this new missile defense systems erected in Poland to defend Europe against a possible missile launch from Iran. I mean, this is obviously a lie. It's part of this geopolitical struggle that's going on between the United States, Europe, and Russia. It's got nothing to do with Iran. And anyway, you get to the end of the op-ed and you look at the guy's name. So we're talking about Raytheon, right? I mean, they're the ones that are in and then you're like, well, who's that guy? Well, he works for Raytheon. So it's kind of like America needs a new transportation policy. Our cities are congested with traffic. So let's go down to the Ford dealership and interview the head of the used car division. What do you think is the solution to America's well, I think you ought to come down and buy a new Ford. I mean, like at a certain point, people need to sort of awaken and realize that they're swimming in a sea of propaganda. Every time they turn on the television, there is an undeclared interest that is influencing them. And I'll leave you with this one last thing. I mean, it at least bears some analysis and investigation. What does it mean when the United States Congress just wholesale transfers $40 billion to some purportedly government structure in Kiev? Like, where's the accounting? Where is the money going? How is a military resistance being organized? But we just say, oh, it's just sent to the Ukraine. We'll just assume that these funds are properly and legally and in a disciplined manner used for erecting a military resistance. How do we know that?
And then when Senator Rand Paul asks to add in an oversight the way that we have in Afghanistan, he's mocked and laughed at and yelled at by his Republican colleagues for wanting to put in some sort of an accountability measure to see where this money is actually going. 2 weeks after CNN releases a story about how we have no idea where these weapons go after they're in the battlefield. They literally fall into the hands of other people. It's unbelievable. One question, Doc, we'll get you out of here on this question, which is, I hear this from a lot of people in our live streams and in our chats who've had the vaccine. I have been vaccinated. I had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There's a lot of people who I think were well-intentioned, right? We were told that this would prevent the spread. It would help the elderly population. So we were the good stewards. We were the good soldiers, right? And we went out and did this. Do people who have not had an adverse reaction in a year or 2 years need to worry about anything? For instance, me having the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, whatever it was, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago now, or people that have had Pfizer vaccines and boosters, and it's been weeks now, months. Are they in the clear, or could we expect more adverse effects, adverse reactions in the months and weeks to come?
I think you're right. People feel burned. They were sold a bill of goods. They were told it stops transmission, would make you safe in the workplace around your senior citizens and your family. It was all basically not supported. In a sense, it was a medical lie. The vaccines did not stop spread. They don't even work in preventing COVID-19. It should be obvious. Anderson Cooper, 3 shots, Bill Gates, 4. They both get COVID. Anderson Cooper asks Bill Gates for medical advice. And Bill Gates, being completely co-opted and interested in vaccine development and benefits from vaccine development, advises more shots, even though they've had COVID. I mean, it's complete and total mass formation psychosis. It's lunacy. But starting out, you're right. Reasonable people did take the vaccine early. I've been following patients in my practice very carefully. And I've concluded that if nothing has happened at this juncture, I really don't expect anything to happen because the body slowly gets rid of the genetic material and the spike protein that's produced. However, if complications have developed, like a blood clot or heart damage, I can tell you I'm following these patients and the problems are not going away promptly. And I'm really worried about this. The last 2 weeks, I've had 2 cases of heart damage. It's been more than a year and it's still evident clinically and on imaging. I've had blood clots that will not go away after a year of blood thinners and really pushing hard to get these to dissolve. I'm really worried. People have been damaged by these and they're furious.
And what do you say? I see on the media nonstop every morning. You click on CNBC or some other. FDA approves. 3rd booster shot from Pfizer, and now for 5 years and under. And I see news anchors on CNN. Literally, one of their news anchors from the morning show. We played it here, where she said, "I'm smiling this morning. I am so excited. Can you see?" She says, "Can you see my smile? I am so excited because now my little ones can get these shots." And I couldn't believe what I was seeing on national television.
You're right. There was actually a few months ago, there was a CNN anchor, a mother who was upset that her children couldn't get their vaccine right away. And then on another channel was Mercedes Schlapp. I know this because I went on with her, who said she felt relief that at least for a few months her children would be protected against the menace of the vaccine. People are in a very distorted way using children as human shields. The reason why she felt so good is not about her kids, is she actually has a deep psychological fear of COVID herself and wants to use her kids as a human shield in her household. It's really disturbing. The psychology behind this is disturbing. The children have no opportunity for benefit. The CDC has already said 75% of kids have already had it, so the vaccine can't benefit them whatsoever. And then the pivotal clinical trials paper by Frank and one by Walther, and then there's a safety paper from the CDC by House, all show that kids get far sicker with taking the vaccine than they would just with getting COVID.
Yeah. Well, I took the vaccine and got COVID twice, and so did my wife, and all of our kids have had it. Thankfully, they have no vaccine. So unbelievable. The book is called The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. And I got to tell you guys, I mean, that's just that term, because we talk about the military-industrial complex here on the show. I think we're going to be doing a lot more stories here about the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex, and it's a absolute must-read. Everyone should read this book. And I think your life will be changed as a result. Dr. Peter McCullough, John Leake, thank you guys so much for joining us on here on Redacted to tell us your thoughts. And we'd love to have you back on as we learn more about these things and as this fraud continues to perpetuate.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.